Well, hello there. It's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter Podcast. The Savvy Painter Podcast is published every other week on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, iHeartRadio, and Google Play. If you are a painter who is looking for down-to-earth, real-life conversations about art, how to create it, and how to sell it, you are in the right place. Savvy Painter has been downloaded over 1.5 million times by artists in 150 countries. This is the place where you will find your community. You'll be inspired to create, and you'll hear real stories from artists who are thriving with their art. So if you are new to this podcast, I want to welcome you to the Savvy Painter community. But make sure that you don't miss an episode. Sign up for weekly updates, free guides, and workshop announcements. Just go to savvypainter.com/subscribe. It's that easy. This week, I am excited to introduce you to Claudia Rilling. Claudia studied painting at Boston University and went on to get her MFA at the Academy of Art in San Francisco. She's currently represented by the Ellens Eagle Smith Gallery. In this episode, Claudia and I talk about her search for her own direction during grad school, making a pivot with her work, and her continual pursuit to expand her painting skills. Claudia and I both studied with Israel Hershberg at JSS in Chavita, and although we missed each other by a year, we both reference our experiences there. There are a lot of little jewels in this conversation, my favorite being this one from Claudia.
What I realized was no matter what subject you're working with, the accomplishment is creating your own visual language that's unique to you.
I think that one is worth posting above your easel. And for my fellow technique geeks, Claudia shares the specifics of her painting. Everything from setting up her canvas, choosing colors for her underpainting, mounting canvas to board, and what she uses to do that, plus what attracts her to a subject and how she knows when a painting is done. Here is Claudia Rilling. So hello, Claudia, and thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I really appreciate it. Welcome to Savvy Painter.
Yeah, thank you, Antrice, and thanks for asking me to be your guest. I'm really honored.
Tell me a little bit about when you got started painting. I would love to hear about your early influences, any artists that you used to look at that made you think, wow, I'd really love to do this.
Yeah, definitely. So how I got started painting was really via the route of drawing. So when I was 16, my mom, I would say, dragged me to meet this art instructor up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Myron Barnstone, who had a private studio with very rigorous instruction in classical drawing and design. And as a 16-year-old, that was just like the most amazing thing to be exposed to, really intense, I call it training. When in high school, it was just a lot of, just kind of more crafty stuff. And when I was finally shown that there's a way to measure, there is a way to cite angles and cite relationships, and studying from plaster casts and learning all about classical design systems, I was like, oh my gosh, like eureka, it was like, this is it for me. And so that's kind of the long way of telling you how I got into becoming a painter. It was really through studying classical drawing and design. And I didn't really learn how to paint until, I would say, grad school, years and years later.
When you were discovering that this was a thing that you were interested in back when you were 16, what were some of the artists that really inspired you, that made you?
One of my favorite artists, and I think people see the evidence of his influence in my work, is the English painter Ewan Uglow. I was introduced to him as a teenager through Barnstone, and I was like, oh my gosh, he's combining everything I was really jazzed about. So, beautiful line, including a bit of line and a bit of evidence of geometry and painting, and then just these flat, plain relationships, and then beautiful, like, negative spaces were carved out in his paintings. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's this guy painting like this in England. Amazing. Other painters, actually, I was also introduced to at the time were like Anne Gale.
Really?
She was pretty early in her career. Yeah. And I was really excited about her mark making. And then my other big influences were like Morandi, Corot, Degas, Seurat, like all those.
Yeah. You mentioned with Uwanuglow's work that you really love the negative space and the geometry and all the mark making and measurements, which absolutely can see that in your work. But I'm curious about some of these other artists that you mentioned, like with Anne Gale and Corot and Degas. What was it that you really responded to in their work?
Anne Gale, like that beautiful control of value and tone. Those marks are just exceptionally beautiful, the way she builds her surfaces. With regards to Degas, probably composition, shape design, space relationships. There's a lot of abstraction in his work, like even the way, he manipulates like the positioning of, say it's a little ballerina, like her feet and her legs in order to create certain angles. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. So everything, he'll sacrifice so much realism for the sake of creating dynamic designs. So as like the structure of his paintings are unbelievable to me.
When you describe that Degas sacrifices some of the reality for the structure of his painting, and just reminding me of this documentary I saw on Uwanuglow, where that man is obsessive about being precise. Like you can see it in his work. Obviously, when you see his work, you can see it. I don't know if there's a documentary where it's from the 70s. The intro is hilarious because it's so 70s, but he's working on this painting and he's so precise about the way the model is set up, and everything is so exact that it's the contrast between his precision and what you were just describing with Degas, I think is really interesting.
I know. And Therese, was that the video where his model quits on him? It's funny. I watched that when I was studying with the JSS. Another student had that video. That was incredible, brutal to find a model with those exact proportions. I couldn't believe it. But it's funny, like when I examine Uglow's work, there's part of it that's absolutely precise. And the other part has absolutely nothing to do with like high realism at all. So like it's like this searching, and he's constantly breaking the contour and breaking lines. So there's actually a lot of imperfection in it. So I know, but it is kind of mind-boggling that he is like this. His search is so intense to find something, the certain thing he's looking for.
Yeah, not being inside of his head. It's so you always want to put an artist in a box, maybe to sort of understand and go like, oh, okay, Uwanuglow is so precise. Like he's all about accuracy and precision. So then when he's not, it kind of like blows your mind a little bit. It's kind of like, how does that work with this idea that I have of him, even though it's probably has nothing to do with what his ideas were, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And he also turns all of his forms, all the human forms, into like cubes and blocks. So like they're restructured completely. So it really, there's nothing realistic about them. So I think he's a really interesting painter, but
he's fascinating. So I love like hearing the background and the artists that you really respond to and who influenced your work really early on. And then ask this question, which is, for people who've never seen your work, how would you describe it?
Oh, that's so tough because people, I'll meet people and they'll say, what do you do? And then you say, no, now I have to tell them I'm a painter and how am I going to describe this? I tell them that my work is, somewhat realistic, but also simplified into a lot of simple shapes, that I'm interested in geometry. So I kind of leave it at that.
I get this question a lot from listeners. So I'll kind of preface this by saying when people say, what do you do? I tend to adapt the answer based on the situation and what I might be able to guess about the person asking the question. So I'm wondering when people ask you what you do, does it make you uncomfortable, or does it make you go, oh my gosh, how do I explain to them that I'm an artist, but I'm a real artist?
Oh, that happens all the time. Yeah, that happens all the time. And I think I do, depending on who I'm talking to, I usually don't want to talk about what I do. I think most people, if you're not a painter, I mean, it's such a specific language. Even if I try to explain, okay, I'm interested in, I say I work with cityscape and landscape, but I simplify them in this certain kind of way and interpret them in this certain kind of way. It's a painting, it's a language about painting. So, and also I'm very private about my work. I'm not the type of person who's like, now I'm this, very like bohemian person who embraces everything artsy and artistic and hey, this is who I am. I embrace it. I don't know. I feel like even for me, it's kind of a private part of my life. So then to have to explain it to people is always a little bit tricky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a tough one because some people are asking because they're searching for a common ground. They're looking for they're just politely trying to start conversation. And most people don't have the language, like you said, to talk about it. So if you explain it like you did just now, they would be completely lost, or they might imagine something totally different. And then occasionally you get people who actually know who these artists are. So if you were to say like, oh, this is what I do, they might be able to say, oh, like you and Uglo, or oh, like this, or oh, just something to like go, oh, I kind of know what you're talking about. And they're genuinely interested in it. And then the conversation gets fun. Otherwise, it's just kind of like this awkward, yeah, I'm an artist.
Oh, definitely. I know it's always so fun to like find your people and the people who even like the same exact artists as you do. That's why I went to study with the JSS. I'm like, oh, they're my people. Gold. They follow the same painters. And yeah. You don't have to explain yourself.
Yes. It's such a relief. Oh my gosh. It's like, yeah, you're home. I definitely get that feeling there. So tell me a little bit about after college, when you first got started out as an artist. Tell me a little bit about your experiences there. What happened? What did you do after you?
I guess I would say that I didn't really feel like college prepared me for being a professional painter at all. There were 2 years in college where they provided us with some foundations classes that were okay, some drawing and painting. And then 2 years, I mean, here I am like 19, 20, 21 years old, and they're saying, I'll work on your own. And we had some sort of famous painters coming to give us critiques. And I went into my 20s, continued to dabble with painting. And I always wanted to learn how to paint well. Like I said earlier, when I was studying with this like master, draftsman and designer, he really taught us how to draw beautifully. So I was kind of lost when it came to mark making. So all through my 20s, I was just making these hard-edged paintings. And I was just unhappy. And every mark I put down, I would surround it with a line. I would outline it.
Wow.
Drawing was still my language. And I'm like, gosh, this just looks so artificial, looks so stiff and fake. Then I worked for a couple of years for Anthropology Corporation in Philly. I was living in Philly for about 4 years. And towards the end of my time in Philly is when I decided I wanted to go to grad school. Thought, you know what, it was either like, okay, go into maybe graphic design or continue with painting. And when I was researching painting programs, I decided on the Academy of Art in San Francisco, mainly because they required you to continue taking foundation painting and drawing courses before you even started on your thesis.
Interesting.
So in my 20s, I was floundering as a fine artist, absolutely. And so that's why I went to grad school.
Yeah. I guess what I'm wondering is how you approach that. So when you were in grad school, were you just kind of thinking like, okay, I chose this particular program, so I'm going to trust it and do what they say? Or were you more self-directed in, I want to learn these things and I'm going to look for the opportunities to learn those things?
I would say it was exactly like that. The latter. I was very particular about which teachers I wanted to study with. I had pretty good sense of what I needed to learn because I understood geometry and design and drawing. And I really needed to have people show me how to put down marks, how to just put down a nice mark and leave it without outlining it. So, and that's what like the painters were doing there. Like people definitely for the most part, weren't putting graphic marks all over their canvases. So And then the second half of my MFA program was creating my own body of work. So then I was free to do whatever I wanted.
Do you remember any particular takeaways or like things that really were pivotal for you during your time there?
Yeah, definitely. I still had my heart set on being a figurative painter. I love Jen Gale, Egon Schiele, these like evocative, expressive painters. But really, who I was as a painter, and I didn't realize it for a little while, was a painter who just liked to work with flatter shape relationships. And so I had worked really hard to come up with a thesis idea that was convincing to our thesis committee. And the proposal for my thesis project was going to be to do a series of figurative paintings. And I was so unhappy. I was like, I can't believe I'm about to embark on this project. And
why were you unhappy about that?
Because I wasn't a figurative painter. And I would walk every day to my studio over Russian Hill into North Beach in San Francisco. And I would look at these rooftops. It would be like 8 a.m. and the rooftops would be covered in a bit of fog. So the palette was super unified. It was very high key. It was quite cool. And then there would just be bits of warm notes here and there, little rectangular shapes. Oh, the windows, the negative space created by the buildings. I'm like, oh my gosh, I think this is my language. Like this is the kind of thing I should be painting. So I rewrote my whole entire thesis project. And I was so scared that it wouldn't be approved and that I would like fail out of grad school. Do you know the painter Mark Tennant?
I know his name.
Yeah, he's a great painter. He was my director at the time. And I came to him, I said, I don't think I'm a figurative painter. And I created a sample. I painted the cityscape, like a really small cityscape. I'd stretched my own little canvas. And that was North Beach #1. And I showed it to him and he really liked it. And that was when I was like, okay, like I think I found my language. So it was a huge change for me.
I mean, you said you weren't a figurative painter, but that was what you thought you wanted to do because you were so influenced by these other artists. Did you resist that? Did you think it sounds like you did a little bit in the thought, but then you dove right into it. Was that a hard decision to make?
Yeah, it was. For some reason, it felt like failing, because it's like being able to master the figure is just such an incredible accomplishment. It seemed to me like this is the ultimate accomplishment, to be an excellent figurative painter. But what I realized was no matter what subject you're working with, the accomplishment is creating your own visual language that's unique to you. So it doesn't really matter what the subject was.
I love that. Everybody who's listening, write that down. That is so important. It is, because I think we get lost in the details, and the details meaning like these labels of I paint X or I paint Y, and not really understanding that this is another language that we're learning, and understanding that and being able to communicate in that language is more important than the detail of whether it's figurative or this or that.
Yeah, definitely. And there was also, I could send you the link to this article, but in the Wall Street Journal just had an article about Manet, and they reiterated this quote. It's about one of his floral paintings, and the quote was, Manet's quote is, "A painter can say all he wants to with fruit or flowers." And that's one of my favorite quotes. I always go back to that. Doesn't matter what the painter's subject is.
Yeah. When you said that, it just made me think of some of the conversations I've had before, and particularly about painting flowers, that there is a perception that it's
like too sweet, or
yes, too saccharine, too sweet, too feminine, and also that only women can do it, or that it's a women's thing, and it makes me laugh so much.
Yeah, look at
it's so ridiculous.
Mirandi was painting roses, Yeah. I mean, come on. Yeah. It's so funny. It's so easy to dispel that pretty quickly too. Just list the painters who do it so beautifully. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's funny and it's true in a way. Like, I think it's sad that artists who paint flowers have that sort of stigma, that they feel that, and it's in the back of their heads, at least, if they don't worry about it. But then also that people do say that and think that. So I would love to hear about your process and your painting and why you choose your subjects and all these millions of things. So let's start with a single question of how do you choose your subject? What is it that sort of lights your fire and makes you think that?
So it depends. I have a few bodies of work going right now, which is always kind of a bad thing because I like my work to stay pretty cohesive. But despite what I'm painting or what subject I'm painting, what I look for, I try to imagine everything in a series of tonal relationships. I look at the negative spaces and the positive spaces, and that's what draws me in. So if all of the shapes are working, whether they're organic forms or rectangles in a cityscape, and when I create, say, like a square or rectangle boundary around them, and I'm looking at them and they start to work on a very abstract level, then I'm really excited. I'm like, oh, look at those shapes. Look at those relationships. That is so exciting. And then I think about the color. I'm like, okay, and how about the color palette? How about the key? Is this like kind of more low key? Is this high key? I gravitate towards a high key palette. And then I look for color notes that kind of dance around the composition. I'll also just throw those in towards the end of the painting, or maybe when I start the painting, if they're not bright enough. So yeah, I start with the abstract elements, then slowly start to think about the more nuanced details.
I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into that. Can you describe like what happens when you set up like your blank canvas? Because these are all painters listening, so you're not going to lose.
Right.
They're going to be on the edge of their seat, just like what's.
It's funny. I mean, you should see how many notes I have from your interviews with artists. I take notes. So sometimes I've realized that I can't really listen to the interviews that you conduct while I'm painting because it's so disruptive.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something I used to do. I used to spend days or maybe a week deciding on my composition. And then, I mean, not like all day, every day, but, on and off throughout the week. Once I decided on my composition, I would build my canvas, my substrate, to be the exact dimensions of my composition. So I never tried to make a composition fit into an 18 by 24 inch canvas. Now I've relaxed my compositional neuroses a little bit. So I do work with a lot of standard sizes, but I didn't used to do that. So I would spend a really long time. So I'd build my canvas with stretcher bars or going to, Lowe's and having them cut my panels for me to these very specific sizes, whether it's just a primed wood surface or canvas. I'll tone it and then I'll start my drawing. And then I always use some kind of tonal underpainting. Sometimes when I'm plein air painting, or oftentimes when I'm plein air painting, I don't use a tonal underpainting, but definitely in my studio, I play with tonal underpaintings, and it might be a bright blue, it might be an alizarin crimson, it might be like an umber color. And from that point, I start to block in the big relationships. And then I feel like my work probably evolves like a lot of other painters' pieces evolve after that point.
Mm-hmm. What makes you decide if you're the underpainting color? Is there a strategy behind it, or is it whatever was there?
It's just fun. Like I have to allow myself to have some surprises happen in my work. So the piece that I'm working on right now, I started with alizarin crimson underpainting just for the heck of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason. That's a bright color. My colors are so muted. I'm not so muted. I don't like that word, actually. There's so much white in my paint. The colors become so soft.
Neutral.
Yes, they're so neutral that I needed some color to start with.
Okay, I always have to ask these questions because I know what's going to happen. Somebody's going to be like, Claudia always starts with alizarin.
Yeah, it's so funny. There's no rhyme or reason. Well, actually, no, I will say once in a while there is. Sometimes if I know I'm going to have a overall very cool palette, I will intentionally start with a warmer underpainting. So that comes through to balance all the cools. But for the most part, it's really, I like to play with those colors.
Gotcha. And because I can see so much Yuan Yuglo influence in your work, I'm so curious about how you establish the geometry of it. Are you freeforming it, or do you plan that all out? How do you approach Well, there's the mark making and the shapes.
Yeah. I guess going back to what I learned when I was a teenager, like at that point it was like we would have to pre-plan everything, and we were using light tables to create these compositions and then rearrange our paintings to fit into certain rectangles. And it was so stagnating for me. Like I really couldn't get work done. So now my work, it's very intuitive. I can just see, I look at intervals really carefully, like, okay, I'm looking to my right just because by looking at one of these paintings I'm working on, I can kind of answer your question. Like I'll make sure that the intervals are all balanced. Like, so maybe if there's, say, like a wide building, that there's also one a little bit more narrow, maybe in between those two buildings, is that negative space, the width of that negative space really beautiful compared to the width of the positive space? And then that's how I think about the whole entire composition the whole time, with regards to intervals and placement. And then the shapes and some organic forms, maybe the way like one form turns into another. Like if I see a curve, well, does that curve continue somewhere else and hit something else? So that there's like these lines kind of beautifully connecting in this very abstract way.
Do you feel like you have a different approach, for example, when you're painting landscapes versus, I'm just thinking because I know you know Civita so well. So as you're describing that, I was just like imagining what you would do in this particular location that I like to paint, but I have no idea if you do or not.
Where was it?
The parapet, like around the outside of the city. And let's see. So if you can kind of cut through these alleys and get to the back wall where you're looking towards the fort. Oh no, people who are listening to this are going to be like, what? If you're at the fort, there's one particular spot that everybody loves to paint where you're sitting in front of a gate, but you have a view of the outside city wall and the ravine. So this is looking towards that gate. I think most people know where that gate is because you see like everybody tries to snag that spot.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh. I know what you're talking about.
So anyway, so I'm kind of curious, the way that you just described that and your love of the negative shapes and how you look at things, I'm curious if you approach a landscape versus structural elements versus a still life differently, or do you feel like your approach is the same?
Gosh, I would say it's pretty much the same.
Really?
Yeah. Like I just can't help it. It's just what I gravitate towards. Like I wouldn't paint, just recently I've been painting some florals. I'm interested in the same kind of shape arrangement in florals as I am in a landscape or a still life, landscape or a cityscape. There is definitely like in a cityscape, it's just that there are more repeating verticals and horizontals, but you can't just rely on verticals and horizontals. There also has to be a lot of organic connections that the eye is making as well. So the eye kind of moves around in a circular way too. So I'm just more aware of that when I'm dealing with cityscape, that I have to make sure it's not too rigid.
Okay. And when I asked you the question about your process and how you start out, you kind of thought about it for a second and said, I'm going to tell you how I used to do it. So of course, the follow-up question, Claudia, how do you do it? If that's how you used to do it, what is different now and why did you change it?
I needed to produce work. And I found that when I was taking such a long time to decide on a composition and then stretch my canvases, it slowed me down so much that I felt like it was very frustrating to be a painter. Like if I'm going to work this slowly, where's the fun? Like where's the spontaneity? So now I work with a lot of squares. I think that solved the problem for me with regards to the fact that, I can buy those prefab. I can get squares in so many different sizes. So now I'm used to composing in a square and I can do it pretty quickly. And if I want a custom size, I can certainly order it or build it.
This is a really getting into the minutia question, but do you prefer canvas or panels and why?
Oh, good question. I like both. I really like both. My favorite canvas to work on now is this oil primed linen. and I'll glue it down to my little, especially my little planner panels. I glue it down, I cut the edges, and then I have these beautiful little jewel-like panels with oil primed linen glued to them. For my larger pieces, I'm usually working directly on primed wood that I'll just prime with, acrylic primer. And once in a while, I will adhere the oil primed linen to a larger rigid wood substrate, but I always work on a rigid support for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
People ask me this all the time. And I know like Israel uses just straight up when he glues his canvas. I think he just uses Elmer's glue. I might be wrong on that. Really, just really basic stuff. And I use matte medium, but knowing that at the same time that is locked down and it's not going, like there's no way to get it back up, which is why Israel uses Elmer's glue. But what do you use to?
I've used Elmer's glue. I've used jade adhesive. If you've ever heard of that, it's like a pH neutral. Yeah, jade adhesive. And then I also I watched a video on how to apply. I was like, I really want to perfect my method.
I know.
Yeah, I was watching YouTube videos about how to apply or adhere canvas to panels. So our Artists and Craftsmen Supply here in Philly, I bought something called Laminol.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, so Laminol. So you brush it down onto your panel. You let it dry completely on your panel, and then you take your canvas and you iron it on, and the heat creates the bond. Yeah, and then you just trim off the edges. So
cool. And I'm guessing because you iron it on, it's like perfectly.
Exactly. Yeah. It's going to be perfectly adhered because it's always the edges. I'm like, the edges will start to peel up and it drives me crazy. So I'm going in with like tiny, tiny little brushes with like little bits of glue, like adhering the edges down.
Nice. Okay. Love it. We're such art geeks, right?
I know. These little like techniques. Yeah. What kind of glue we use. I know.
It's inevitable. We're all going to do it. And then everybody's going to go buy that and try it. And I'm going to get a million emails like, what's that stuff called? And where did she get it?
I know. Isn't that funny? Well, I say, go ahead and try it. Yeah. I still haven't done it. I have the can right here and I'm like, okay.
Is it a spray?
No, it's an adhesive concentrate that you dilute down with a little bit of water, just in like a big plastic jar.
Got it. Okay. So I wanted to know all about your process. So we're talking about, this is maybe one of the most, not cliche, but often asked questions. When do you know that you're done with the painting? Like when you're playing with all these shapes and doing all this stuff, when do you go like, yep, stop?
It's a great question. And it's one that I talk to other painters about. And you probably know I teach. And it's a question I have my students discuss. Okay, I'll say this. I love this quote. It's kind of a cheesy artist quote, but it takes two painters to finish a painting, one to paint it, another one to tell them to stop, right? So, I mean, you have to show the work to other people. I'm sure there are some painters that are confident to stop on their own, but, I'll show the work to other painters and get their feedback. And then if I feel like I'm just kind of noodling around a lot, I'm like, okay, like you're either going to stop working right now or you're going to like destroy an area and then repaint it so that it's fresh again. So like some paintings I'll work on for a year. Some paintings, and like I'm never really sure when they're done. Some paintings come together really quickly. I'm like, oh, wow, I worked on that for 3 sessions. It's done. And I know. So I don't know the answer to that question. It's always really hard for me. And then I'm unsure of myself. Sometimes just sending it out into the world is helpful. Because then you have no choice. You don't have the option of working on it anymore.
I love it.
Yeah.
And I love hearing that too, because it is a thing that so many artists struggle with or want to know, like, okay, because we all, I think, even though we hate it, we wish for formulas. Like we want a thing. We want like the lightning bolt or the angels to sing or something to happen or some definitive answer. And the uncomfortable answer is there isn't one like that. I think for me, it's when I've done what I intended to do. Thinking of it that way, I think is really helpful, but it's not always easy.
Oh, it's not easy. And even then, sometimes we second guess ourselves. Oh, actually, there is one thing that I think about. Because when we're working on developing our own paintings, we see all the little details. So to step back from your work and ask yourself if all the main relationships are working beautifully.
Mm.
That helps me sometimes.
What do you do when you find yourself in that situation? You sort of mentioned that, if you're noodling it or if you're getting really fussy in a particular area, is that when you send it out to, call a friend?
Yeah, probably. I mean, come on, we've got these iPhones, just take a photo, shoot it over to a friend. That's usually the quickest way to do it. But there's no replacement for someone seeing it in real life. So as often, I think, as you can get someone you trust in your studio, and they don't necessarily have to be a painter either. I've had friends who just have such a great eye. They've given me amazing feedback. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you were working on a couple of different series, and that it sounded like, you correct me if I'm wrong, that, on the one hand you enjoy that, but on the other time you like to have things like really cohesive. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I would love to hear what it is you're working on, and also what it is that makes you uncomfortable about the project or the series.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. So what makes me uncomfortable with working on a few bodies of work at one time is that I'm afraid that my work is going to kind of fall apart, that it's going to lack cohesion and the pieces will no longer relate to each other and my visual language isn't going to be clear anymore. And what was happening to me before I went to grad school was exactly that. Like, I was just kind of all over the place, and it's a place I just don't want to be again. What I'm working on right now is I've fallen in love with outdoor painting. So, I do a lot of landscape painting, and those very small pieces are a way for me to, develop my language of painting without any pressure. But they're also, while I do them like pretty quickly, they're also a really serious body of work. And then I have some cityscapes I'm working on, remnants from California. Now I'm really falling in love with the Philly cityscape. It's so cool, but like the colors are so different. These really rich reds, like they look like Dutch paintings. And then one of the things I do once in a while is just become a student. So I was taking a course with John Redmond, fantastic painter. And I thought, what am I going to work on? Just to kind of learn from him. I want a new subject to explore while I'm in his classroom. And I'm using florals. I was using florals for that for the most part. I did some other things. So I have this in my studio, I'm just kind of looking to my right. I have a wall, a whole line of little florals. I have my wall of very small little plein air pieces. And then I have my larger cityscape and landscape pieces. So
cool.
Yeah.
It sounds so much fun. And for those of you listening, you can't see Claudia, but her face just totally lit up when she was talking about those pieces.
Oh, yeah. That's so funny.
Which is that enthusiasm and just that pure joy out of creating is, I think, why we do what we do.
Yeah. Yeah. And also entries, it's nice because when I get tired of one body of work, I can kind of switch to the other. So it keeps things fresh and then they end up informing one another.
Exactly.
So that it does. I think in the long run, it will pay off. Right now I'm a little frustrated because I feel like my work feels a bit fragmented, but I'm trying to trust that process.
Yeah, I think that's so, I don't know, that to me, that's so critical. It's just trusting your instinct, your inner wisdom, the process of painting and working it out. And I don't know, it used to make me very uncomfortable. I think actually that's something that I really took. I do this podcast, but Anne Gale, I think, told me at one point during our conversation, she's like, I see what you're doing. You're just picking everybody's brains and getting all the information.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, of course I am.
Of course. Yeah, I would do the same. Gosh. Yeah. We all kind of do that to each other. I get together with a friend who's doing, something really cool in her studio. I'm like, and why did you do that? Wait, how about that mark there? That blue mark?
Yeah. And, one of the things that there's many things, but, from from JSS and from doing this podcast and from talking to so many artists. But what I'm thinking about right now is just, for me, working on several paintings or working on several series at the same time was terrifying. Like I'm super crazy structured. So I need to have my little compartments. And if something doesn't fit, I'm like, whoa, which is somehow in a way seems weird for an artist, but I actually think now I know better and I think it makes sense. But I've just found that working on several paintings or several series at once it's liberating, because for me, my experience, at least with it, is that I don't get as precious. And when I get stuck, I can go do something else, which allows my mind to percolate and to just kind of like in the background, figure out what it was about that one that I left for the moment that I'm not getting, that needs help, or that I need to connect some dots or understand something differently. So I can play with something else that's totally different. And then they inform each other always. And all of a sudden I'll be like, oh, that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think also that, like with what you're doing with landscapes and flowers and buildings, I would be very curious to see this and know later on, like 2 years from now, how they informed each other, because they're not, a lot of that stuff, like the big connecting of the dots, isn't obvious, I don't think, to the artist while they're doing it. It's only sort of in hindsight that they're able to look back and go, oh, wow, look at that. Like if I hadn't done that rose, then that landscape or that cityscape would not have had that one little detail that turned the painting.
Exactly. That's why we have to just trust this process.
So I kind of want to go into, I've gotten into the nitty gritty details of your paintings and how you paint in general. If this isn't too vague or broad of a question, I would love to hear your thoughts on kind of what you're seeing in the painting world these days. Like, what do you see that you're kind of excited by, and what do you see that you're kind of repulsed by?
Okay, I'll say this. I spend a lot of my time painting and teaching, and I hope that element, like the art market and the art world, I'm almost like, well, I'll have other people figure that out for me. So I wouldn't say that I'm the best person to ask about those kind of things. I mean, in order to experience painting, you really have to see it in real life. And there's so many, everything is online right now. I think that's a little bit sad. And obviously, like all these galleries closing is very heartbreaking, because they're so important. They're so important for building the artist career, to getting people in and buying and collecting seriously. So I guess that would be my 2 cents about it.
Seeing art in person and just watching the decline of that being readily available.
Yeah. And a lot of people looking at, work in, little thumbnails on their tiny little screens. That's not necessarily what that work actually looks like. And then people also, people defining themselves by their Instagram followers or the comments or likes they get. It's kind of irrelevant. Like, your success is really defined in various ways, but it's kind of like the saying, like, sometimes it's like hive mentality and we need the gatekeepers. So I wouldn't let people be too driven by Instagram followers.
Okay, yeah.
Some of the best painters I know have like 200 followers on Instagram.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen some amazing painters and I'm just like, wait, what? Okay. But, to me, what that means is they're busy painting.
Exactly. They're absolutely busy painting. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So kind of with that, I mean, you may have already just given it, but because you teach so much and because you're kind of seeing like a new generation maybe of painters come up, what do you wish you had known when you first started out?
When I first started out, just learning how to draw and paint.
Or let's say like when when you left the nest, so to speak, when you first were sort of on your own as an artist and weren't in school anymore or in that environment.
Okay. Yeah. I think what it would be is, I can only speak from my own experience. So I would say that if you like have accumulated a lot of skills and you're, pretty decent painter, but other than that, you're really not enjoying what you're doing and your process and you're feeling very stuck, I would really ask yourself if what you're painting truly reflects what you're interested in. So like for me, it took abandoning organic forms or abandoning the figure. I guess that's my answer to that question.
Which I think is excellent and also does sort of speak to what you just said earlier about the hive mentality and what social media is sort of bringing and just the current environment that we're in and that we've created for ourselves, which, what you really did was you sort of trusted your instinct, and listened to that inner voice, even though it meant something that at the time was probably really scary and, pursuing something that feels unknown to you when you had this idea of where you were going to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like since I was a teenager, I envisioned myself as a figurative painter and it wasn't a good fit for me.
But it brought you to where you are. So
It did. Yeah. So it all worked out. So, all this stuff is great in hindsight. So all this wisdom, yeah.
Yeah. It's just understanding that when you're going through it, it's terrifying it's
really terrifying, but sometimes you just have to go through it.
Yeah.
You have to have like a bad, or like a frustrating 5 or 10 years of your life. And that's okay. A time actually goes by really quickly.
In hindsight, Claudia, in hindsight, right? When you're in there, you're like, oh my God, 5 years. Yeah. I've been doing this for 5 years. How do I know if I'm doing the right thing? Did I just waste 5 years? I think it's so tempting to spiral down that path.
Yep.
So I know we're closing in on the end of our hour, but I have so many more questions.
Feel free to ask, or you can email me.
And I will. Since you kind of brought it up, I will ask you one of my standard questions because I think it's so helpful for other artists to hear this. Could you share a story of when you were kind of struggling or really felt like you were lost maybe, and what you did to correct course or what you learned from that experience?
Yeah, definitely. There were a couple times. The one I've already talked about was when in grad school I was going to pursue the figure and then I changed direction. I would say the other time was more recent. So when I moved from the West Coast to the East Coast, I thought, oh, gee, it'll take me a couple months to be up and running. No, it took a really long time. So I felt like I just couldn't really produce for months and I was very hard on myself about it. And now that I've been back for almost 2 years, the process of painting again on the East Coast with a extremely different light, extremely different cultural influences, the landscape is so very different, especially come summer, it's just like a wall of green everywhere. And I go into Philly and everything's like red and these rich, warm colors. I mean, like, what a striking contrast from San Francisco. So, just to be like, really gentle on yourself. And if you're going through a big transition in your artwork, and to do things that that you can do. So I just kept it really simple. What did I do? Some still life paintings, just dabbling and dabbling and dabbling. And little by little by little, I'm like, okay, I can merge my language that I was using in San Francisco with the environment here. And now I'm having fun again in my studio.
I love it. Very cool. Claudia, thank you so much. It was so much fun to talk to you and hear all your stories.
Yeah, that was really fun. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to Claudia for spending so much time talking with me. I loved getting to know her and getting all that insight. It was fantastic. Hope you enjoyed it too. Show notes for this episode are at savvypainter.com. Just click on the podcast tab and look for Claudia Rilling's episode. You'll see examples of her work, get links to all of the artists that we talked about, and links to connect with Claudia on her website and at Instagram at Claudia Rilling. While you're there, make sure that you don't miss an episode of the podcast. You can sign up for weekly emails. You can also get free guides and a couple other goodies every now and again. And as always, I have a couple of people I would like to give a shout out to. The Savvy Painter podcast is made possible in large part by listeners like you. If you'd like to help out, it's quick, it's easy, and it is a humongous help to the show. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of cash to keep this thing going. Just go to savvypainter.com/support if you would like to help contribute. And with that, a big thank you goes out to Kenneth Burke, Carla Roth, Dinah Stavini, Alexis Redden, Sylvia Bailey, Kathy Beeler, Amy Lamp, Gail Height, Robin Delaney, Kristen Curtin, Art of Joy, Barry Koplowitz, John Ingenberg. John, I have the feeling that I always say your name wrong, so my apologies. Let me know if I'm saying it right, because every time I get to your name, I'm always thinking, oh, am I mangling it or what? And to keep me on my toes and also have some pity for all of the teachers who mispronounced my name while growing up in school, Corinne Salajka? I hope I said your name right. Okay. And then Suzanne Vinci, J.A. Moore, and Shirley Williams. Thank you so much, you guys. I always love hearing from you. And I so appreciate your support of this podcast. So until the next time, this is Antrese Wood with the Savvy Painter podcast. Thank you so much for listening.